Right. My name is Sarah Stern, and I am the founder and president of the Endowment for Middle East Truth. And it is truly a profound privilege and honor to welcome you today to another topical and timely webinar featuring one of my all-time favorite intellectuals, writers, and just generally a fantastic human being, Jonathan Schanzer, from the wonderful think tank where he is the director of research, the Foundation of Defense of Democracies, talking about his book, which just came out of November 3rd this week, an excellent book, Gaza Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War. I just received this book on Saturday of this week, and I've had a hard time putting it down. I have to tell you personally, this book was like a tonic for me to read, because this past May, as the 4,000 missiles were flying into Israel from Gaza, I traveled there in the midst of the war, landing on May 14th. I had a very personal reason for being there. My daughter, Rachel, was about to give birth to her youngest child, Itai. I personally felt honored and privileged to be able to feel firsthand what it's like to hear the chilling blast of the air raid, and we had approximately 60 seconds to wake up our children and grandchildren and run into the sealed room. I felt it was a privilege to be able to report back to our friends and policymakers on Capitol Hill so they might feel a bit of empathy of what it is that the people of the state of Israel have to go through from time to time. For most of my adult life, I've been perplexed that people don't seem to have any facts, any historic memory, or any context of what it is that Israel has been going through and has had to endure just for its people to be able to live in relative peace or in relative calm. That is why I think it is extremely important that we have people such as Jonathan Schanzer, whose phenomenal book tells all the facts and puts everything in context. So I should also say that I was in Israel during the Hitnatkut, the evacuation from Gaza in 2005, when every Israeli resident, every Israeli farm, school, every remnant of a Jewish life was eradicated. The promise by some of my friends on the left who were for this evacuation was that this time the world will remember, even without a negotiating partner, just how far Israel is willing to go for peace. Well, has the world remembered? And why not? Here to answer some of these wonderful questions, or some of these questions, is our wonderful guest today, Jonathan Schanzer. Jonathan, first of all, how do you feel the Biden administration behaved during this war?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sarah. Really great to be with you and great to be with everybody on the call today. And I thank you for your interest in my new book. I'll just say that it was by far the fastest book project I've ever put together. I actually wrote the draft the first draft in 8 days. Then I went to Israel, did some interviews, came back and edited. But the idea was to be able to provide a little bit of that tonic, as you called it, early. And to perhaps begin to set the edge with some of the debates that I know will come when the next round of books do emerge. And that'll be within the next 6 months or so. But the good news is that at least we've got a few months to begin to digest some of this. And that really was the goal. The Biden administration had a really interesting, I would say, a mixed record during the war. Also, I guess there was an episode before the war as well. What I would describe is that there was the good the bad, the worse, and the ugly. And I'll briefly go through what each of those were. I mean, the good was that the Biden administration had Israel's back during the first 9 days of the war. There was no question about it. Efforts at the UN to target Israel were shot down by the Biden administration. Every time there was a dust up about Israeli involvement in, for example, the targeting of the Al Jala Tower, where Hamas was operating that hardware that was designed to disrupt Iron Dome, the Israelis showed evidence, and the Biden administration backed them up. One attack after another against Israel was deflected by the president, and I think it was actually probably an indication of where the president has typically been with regard to Israel, at least as a senator, over the years, and I think he deserves credit for it. But here's where we get to the bad. The bad was the last 2 days of the war. Now, the last 2 days of the war is interesting because on day 9, and watching Israeli TV and Arabic TV and watching reporters from the region, it became clear that the Egyptians had brokered a ceasefire. And the ceasefire was set to take place 2 days later. And so there was basically a window of dwindling hostilities during which it was really clear there was no more heavy targeting on Israel's part. I think they ran out of good targets after having destroyed so many Hamas targets in the previous 9 days. Even Hamas, you could get a sense there was a fatigue setting in with their rocket firing. There just wasn't as much. But it was really interesting. It was within that 2 day period where you knew the war was going to end. That's when Biden's rhetoric on Israel started to get sharp and a little nasty. That's when, the president came out and said that he was, done kidding around when he talked to Bibi Netanyahu, and that he was, talking tough to the Israelis. And this is something that reporters were hearing from the White House in, comments that couldn't be attributed to any one official. And so really what it looked like to me was that Biden was cashing a blank check when it came to that kind of rhetoric that the squad, or as I like to call them, the Hamas caucus, that's what they were looking for Biden to do. And he did it after the war had largely been fought. And I thought it was just a troubling sign of how much politics has come into the way that we deal with national security and Middle East foreign policy. The idea that the president needed to kowtow to the progressive left was deeply troubling to me. Now, the worst part was the American support for Palestinian elections. Now, a lot of people would blame the Sheikh Jarrah real estate controversy as the cause of the war. I don't believe that a legal dispute caused the war. I don't believe that real estate challenges could cause a war. Really, it's rockets and bullets that cause a war, if we're going to be very honest about it. But if you want to look at a reason why Hamas would want to fire rockets, I think you can look no further than the Palestinian elections that had been scheduled in, I guess it was September, October of last year of 2020. It was something that the Trump administration didn't even pay attention to. But when the Biden administration came in, they supported it. Now, I had an interesting conversation with some Biden administration officials where I said, guys, you can't do this. Hamas is going to take part in these elections. And there are laws in the books that were put in place by a guy known as Joe Biden, who actually legislated these laws that would prohibit funding to any instrument of the Palestinian Authority if there was Hamas participation. You're going to have a political and economic crisis if you do this. The response that I got from the administration was, well, who are we to tell others how to hold elections? Look what happened to us on January 6th. We have a flawed democracy. We can't tell other people what to do. And, I said, you're asking for it. Well, eventually, I think, wisdom prevailed. And the Biden administration did push Abu Mazen to cancel those elections. But by the time they were canceled, Hamas was furious. Hamas had been edged out once again from the Palestinian political process, and they were looking to regain the narrative, looking to reassert themselves as the leaders of the Palestinian cause. And in my view, that was likely the motivating factor for them to take advantage of some of the other narratives that were going on at the time, Ramadan, Jerusalem Day, the real estate dispute in East Jerusalem, all that stuff. But I do believe that it was the Palestinian decision to back the Palestinian election and then ultimately to cancel it on the part of the Biden administration that actually led to a war that likely could have been averted. Now, the last thing that I'll just say is the ugly. And the ugly was that throughout this entire conflict, the United States was still actively trying to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. And the idea that the United States could be an indifferent arbiter to this conflict while that was happening was just not realistic. They lost the trust of the Israelis, I think, just by virtue of the fact that Rob Malley, the envoy to this peace process, is still trying to work with the Iranians and to try to bribe them to get back into this diplomatic framework with sanctions relief and other economic perks. And just to put a finer point on it, what really struck me as remarkable as I watched this unfold and I watched the US continue to pursue a nuclear deal after the war was over, and that's this, that should the US get back into the deal with Iran, there will be sanctions relief and other economic perks that are provided to the Iranians. The Iranians are the top patron to Hamas. So indirectly, the United States will be funding Hamas and directly funding Israel in the fifth Gaza war. The next war that happens, the United States will bear responsibility for both sides. And that's something that I don't think we've ever seen before. It was a theory back when we entered into the interim deal of 2013, and then the war broke out in 2014. No one could quite prove back then that the sanctions relief was flowing to Hamas. Today, I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind that that would happen. And it is deeply troubling to me that the Biden administration would continue to go down this path knowing what the outcome would be.
Thank you. Thank you. Speaking about that, we know about Hamas, the Islamic Republic of Iran's proxies with Hezbollah on Israel's north. You just came out with a wonderful piece today in the Dispatch entitled "A New Threat to the Iron Dome," which talks about how they have converted all of these missiles on Israel's north, or many of them, if not all, to precision-guided munitions, and their ability to overpower Israel's Iron Dome. Can you talk a little bit about your piece and whether or not, if Israel does feel that its back is against the wall and they have no choice but to engage in a conflict against Iran, what will happen to the state of Israel from these munitions?
Sure. So the PGM issue, the precision guided munition issue, has been, I think, a really important one that's been overlooked by even informed people who track this part of the world. Aviv Kochavi, the IDF chief of staff, has actually identified PGMs as the second most important or second most deadly threat to Israeli national security, second only to the Iran nuclear program. And here's what's going on. Is you have a lot of these unguided rockets, right? Many of them we've seen, they're fired into Israeli airspace, out of the Gaza Strip. And as many of us know, they don't always hit their targets. Many of them will fly far short or long of their targets. Iron Dome is able to determine where they're going with a quick check of their trajectory, and they can decide whether they want to shoot them down or not. But a lot of them don't land in areas that Israel considers to be worth shooting them down. With PGMs, with precision-guided munitions, they are going to be able to convert these rockets into guided munitions, which means that they'll be able to target something within 5 or 10 yards of where it was intended. And that means that you could potentially see Israel's Kiryat, which is their Pentagon in Tel Aviv, or the Dimona reactor in the south, the nuclear facility, the chemical plant in Haifa, right? Office buildings in Tel Aviv, right? Skyscrapers. These are the sorts of things that would create catastrophic attacks. And this is what Hezbollah is now doing with Iran. And, a few years ago, we believed that there were probably a few dozen in Hezbollah's hands. Today, we believe there are probably a few hundred, and they're going to continue to grow. Now, the Israelis continue to try to take out these weapons transfers. You see a lot of things going boom in the middle of the night in Syria. This is what Israel's doing most of the time when they're destroying things in Syria, is they're preventing the transfer of these weapons to Hezbollah. But there are real questions now about what the future holds. Will Hamas get their hands on PGMs? What about PIJ? What about some of the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria that also may want to target Israel? The Houthis are believed to actually have some of these munitions as well. And so it's for that reason that the Israelis, you'll see, they're engaged in something that we describe now, the Israelis describe as well as the war between wars, which is, Israel conducting asymmetric attacks all over the Middle East. It used to be that it was just, occasional strikes in Syria, maybe a cyber attack here or there, but it's happening all over the Middle East now. And the goal is to try to roll back Iran's capabilities and the capabilities of those proxies so that whatever the next war looks like, it will be less harsh than maybe it is expected to be right now. This is a war of attrition. It is a messy business that the Israelis are involved in right now. And I would also just note here, not so parenthetically, but this would not be necessary if the US was not still flirting with the Iranians on that nuclear program. If they viewed the Iranian threat in the same way that the Israelis did, then there would be an alignment of interests, and Israel wouldn't feel the need to engage in this kind of risky, asymmetric military activity. And I think it's a shame. We didn't see, we didn't see tension over this back during the Trump administration. There were other issues, of course, that arose. No administration's perfect, but on this issue right now, I think you're seeing Israel maybe take risks that it wouldn't necessarily want to take, but it feels like it needs to because of the looming Iran deal and how that might empower the Islamic Republic.
Right, right. You wrote in your, and most of us are very, very aware of how the Islamic Republic of Iran has been funding Hamas. You wrote in your book also about Qatari funding of Hamas. Can you talk a little bit about Qatar's role here?
Absolutely. I mean, the Qataris have been doing this for many years, dating back, I think, to 2008 or 2009. After Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force in 2007, it was the previous emir, Sheikh Hamad, who had actually gone and paid a visit. It's the first foreign leader to visit the Gaza Strip, pledged large amounts of money, continued to make good on those in subsequent years. The assistance ramped up after the Arab Spring, where the Qataris, as well as the Turks, we'll call them the Muslim Brotherhood bloc, were really working assiduously to ensure that Muslim Brotherhood groups, and Hamas is, of course, a splinter of the Muslim Brotherhood, were successful. And so they did it in places like Tunisia and Egypt as well, but Hamas was always on the receiving end of their assistance. As the blockade around the Gaza Strip has tightened, as the Israelis have done more to prevent rockets and other weaponry from coming in, the Qataris have actually worked with the Israelis. And this, I think, is very, very controversial. They've worked with them to be able to provide assistance to the people of Gaza. And of course, the people should be getting assistance. Many of these people are not interested in supporting Hamas. They're probably furious about Hamas rule and the diversion of resources towards tunnels and rockets and other military infrastructure. But the concern has long been that the Qataris have diverted their assistance, their assistance to the Gaza people, and that has gone to build the metro tunnel system or other military assets. I did think that it was interesting, by the way, that when the war was over, Yossi Cohen, who was the outgoing head of the Mossad, publicly stated that it was a failed experiment working with the Qataris, that we can't trust them. But the Qataris are back at it again right now with the UN. There are these credit cards that they're giving out, debit cards that they're giving to the people of Gaza. Look, I would be thrilled if that works, and if those cards prohibit the diversion of cash. I take a very dim view of all of this. I believe the Qataris still want to support Hamas. They don't care what kind. I mean, they keep saying they're doing all of this to prevent conflict. I'm not sure that's true. I think they're fomenting it. And maybe one last note on the Qataris. You'll recall that there was the destruction of the Al Jala Tower right in the middle of the war. This was the building that housed the AP offices, and Israel took a lot of heat for destroying that building. Now, that building, we learned subsequently, had a Hamas office in there that was jamming Iron Dome, and that was the reason for its destruction. But what was, I think, also interesting is that building also housed Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera, you may recall, has been identified by the US government for having been involved with a number of terrorist groups in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And the US military has actually targeted Al Jazeera in the past for its involvement in this activity. And so the question really that I thought never really was answered was, did Al Jazeera know about this? And more importantly, Al Jazeera, because it's funded by the Qataris, did the Qataris know about this? Because that's, they had their agents in that building. And I just think, I'm not making allegations here. I'll just say that there are some open questions here that still haven't been answered. And so I think the Qataris have a lot of, they have a lot of accounting to do. I don't know who will hold them to account, but I certainly think that we should be hearing more about what happened and how they were involved in all of this.
I'm so glad that you mentioned this. In the last administration, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos had given a seminar on foreign funding of U.S. institutions, and the #1 foreign government that has been funding is the government of Qatar, and they're so duplicitous in their intentions, and they make themselves out to be real moderates, and many people in the United States government, still looks at them as frenemies or and speaking about buildings that have multiple purposes, can you speak a little bit about UNRWA's role during the war? UNRWA also has been going around with its hat in hand pleading poverty. And can you talk about what happened to the Gaza director, Matthias Schmal, when he said that Israel conducted the operation with, quote, sophistication, and that the attacks were, quote, precise?
Yeah, I mean, it was a remarkable thing. I mean, as you probably know, FDD has been a pretty fierce critic of UNRWA over the years, as everybody I'm sure on this call knows, that they've perpetuated the fiction of the refugee problem. There was, of course, a refugee problem after the 1948-1949 War of Independence. There were probably 600,000 refugees, but they've all passed on, or most of them have passed on. There's probably 15, 20, maybe 30,000 of them left today, but yet UNRWA now claims that there are 5 million in the books. How? Well, because they recognize the descendants of those refugees. It's passed on from generation to generation. As I understand it, there's maybe 1 or 2 other instances where this happens in the UN system, but really what it serves to do is just to perpetuate the crisis, and it gives the Palestinians purported leverage at the negotiating table that Israel has to somehow solve the refugee crisis. It's not a crisis any longer. It barely exists, if we're to be honest. But UNRWA has also been involved in, allowing Hamas operatives to work within the system. Their textbooks are downright not just anti-Israel, but anti-Semitic. They are perpetuating hate, and they're perpetuating the conflict. So we've been critical all along. Now, after the war was over, UNRWA had a fairly quiet role during the war itself. But when the war was over, you had this official from Gaza come out and actually say, hey, the Israelis allowed for goods to come in, and they were very surgical, which, by the way, I think everybody should recognize. With somewhere in the vicinity of 10,000 munitions that the Israelis dropped in response to the 4,000 rockets fired by Hamas, there were 211 casualties, and that's just a remarkable number. Yes, there were some civilians who were killed, and that's a tragedy. But the sheer nature, that surgical ability of Israel to go in and target primarily those that were responsible for the violent acts, while trying to keep the rest of the population safe, is truly remarkable, and I think a testament to the way that the Israelis traditionally fight these wars. I don't think they're given any credit for it. Most of the time, people look at the disparity in the death toll and blame the Israelis for being the aggressors, which I think we all I think recognize was certainly not the case here. But so the Israelis, fought surgically. I should probably also note, it's worth noting here that the Hamas caucus wants to not only remove Iron Dome from Israel's arsenal, but they want to take away Israel's PGMs, Israel's precision munitions. So what they're basically saying is they want Israel to fire munitions in return that would have a broader impact on the entire Gaza region, right? If you don't hit the terrorists with precision munitions, then you're going to have far more unwanted casualties. And that appears to be the message that the Hamas caucus, the so-called squad, is advocating for when they say that they don't want Israel to get precision munitions. But at any rate, the UNRWA official came out and acknowledged that Israel had fought this war surgically, and that they had also provided a lot of the material and food and other things that they needed. And then after the war was over, UNRWA came out and even noted that there were tunnels that had snaked under or near their facilities. And then Hamas actually barred them from going closer to take a look at them. You got a sense that there was this symbiotic relationship that had existed between UNRWA and Hamas. UNRWA seemed less comfortable with it. They seemed to want to come clean about it after the war. They were shut down pretty quickly in the statements that they were making. The individual that you mentioned, Matthias Schnell, I think his name was declared PNG, basically, persona non grata by Hamas for the statements that he had made. He was being quite honest about everything, and yet he was not allowed to do so. You get a sense, just maybe to sum up, that Hamas has really dominated not just the NGO space, but also the media environment, the way that information is shared. Because Hamas is a terrorist organization, because it's violent, because it's brutal, the Westerners that live within the Gaza Strip, which is essentially a statelet that is controlled by Hamas, Hamas does not allow for that free flow of information. And if you violate whether it's written rules or unwritten rules, spoken or unspoken, if you violate those rules, you can be ejected or perhaps worse. And I think we saw that with UNRWA. I think we probably saw it as well with the Associated Press in the dust up over the Al-Jala Tower destruction as well. There are Hamas rules, and we just, a good example of that is, can you remember seeing during the war any video of a Hamas fighter firing rockets at Israel? I can't remember one. So you have all these media outlets that are operating there, and not one of them was able to get a shot of a Hamas fighter firing one of 4,000 rockets at Israel over 11 days. Remarkable. I think, again, just an idea of how Hamas rules Gaza with an iron fist.
Right. We see, of course, the same thing with Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon and UNIFIL. All of these, it's the bully in the playground syndrome. There's no way when people are fearing for their lives that people really can find the moral courage to tell the truth about what's going on. A friend of mine from the IDF was telling me how during the war, he was monitoring computers, and he saw that ambulances going into a place, it was like right next to an UNRWA school, and rather than taking out bodies, they took dead bodies from the ambulance and they placed it in front of the school and took videos of it. Okay. First of all, somebody just asked a very important question before I hand this over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour, who's our director of emerging democracies out of the Middle East. And that is, how does one purchase this amazing book? Jonathan?
Sure. So it's available now on Amazon. It came out on November 3rd. It's available for purchase. People are telling me that it's usually taking a day or two turnaround before it ships out. So it's coming out. You're able to get it quickly. I'll tell you just a couple other things. It was put out by FDD Press. It's the first time that we've done a book like this. And the goal was for us, usually we create, more scholarly work. The idea was to create something that really felt more like an accessible book that was more of a trade publication, right? You could, like anything else that you'd find on a bookshelf at a Barnes and Noble, if those brick and mortar bookstores still existed. But that was the goal, and so there's a bit of first person writing from me on this, as well as a lot of the history and kind of the inside baseball that you'd expect from a Washington analyst doing this sort of stuff. So so there's that, but it's the first time we've done it. It's all done on demand. So Amazon produces it as soon as you press click. And I'll tell you what's really fun for me is I've been looking at how Amazon markets this, and apparently it's the #1 new book on Iran history, which I love. Like, it's not, they're not even saying Palestinian or Israeli. Iran and Qatar are getting highlighted by the artificial intelligence algorithm that Amazon uses. So I hope that the Qataris and the Iranians are aware that they're being exposed through this book. It's giving me great pleasure.
It gives me great pleasure as well. And now it is also a tremendous pleasure to turn the podium over to my wonderful colleague, Hussein Abubakar Mansour. Hussein?
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for such an amazing presentation. And thank you very much for all our audience who tuned in and sent us so many questions that we're going to get to in a moment. I invite you all to get Jonathan's book, and you will not be disappointed. We've received a number of questions, a lot, about recent news reports floating around that the Biden administration is somehow are putting together or trying to push for a unity government between Hamas and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority. So we received a number of questions about this. So I'm going to start with it. Is this true? Do you know anything about this? What are they trying to achieve? Why are they doing this?
Well, I got to say that it sort of cracks me up because we see these reports come out, I don't know, every couple of months. It kind of reminds me of Lucy and Charlie Brown in the football. We keep hearing that there are going to be unity governments and then they don't happen. But the thing to remember here, and I talked about, what I called, in the good, the bad, the worst, and the ugly, the worst, was that the Biden administration was endorsing Hamas participation in a future Palestinian government. This cannot happen. And so it's one thing if you want to say that the Palestinians need to be more unified in order to be able to reach a two-state solution. That's 100% true. And as I wrote in a previous book, Hamas versus Fatah, The Struggle for Palestine, I mean, I do think that you can't talk about a two-state solution until the Palestinians reconcile. They've been in a state of civil war since 2007, and that's not likely to end anytime soon. But trying to paper that over with a bureaucratic government, whether it's endorsed by the United States or by the French, I understand that the French may be involved in this particular effort, it won't work. As long as Hamas is a terrorist organization, as long as it is funded and armed by Iran, as long as it is endorsing the destruction of the Jewish state, as long as it is embracing violence as a legitimizing tactic for the organization, it's their raison d'etre. So you think about that, and then you ask yourself, how can this group be included? And then more importantly, with the laws that I mentioned earlier, there are laws in place that prohibit funding to the Palestinian Authority as long as Hamas is involved in any way. So there are major hurdles here. Really what needs to be done is I actually had some interesting conversations with former Palestinian leaders and Palestinian moderates who really said that there needs to be some kind of national dialogue inside the Palestinian Authority. Now, I'm not sure that they'll actually get to a consensus, but the idea of having a discussion about the role of Hamas, the role of violence, the role of terrorism, the vision that they have for a Palestinian state, it's never really been done, not in an inclusive way, right? I mean, early on, it was basically Yasser Arafat dictating the terms. Then it became Mahmoud Abbas dictating the terms. Then it became both Abbas and Hamas dictating the terms as they operated out of two different territories. We still haven't heard from the Palestinian people themselves. And so I think the idea of a reconciliation is important, but the way it's done is even more important. You cannot legitimize Hamas. You cannot legitimize its patrons, and you cannot legitimize its violence.
Can I just interject there? According to Khalil Shakaki, who does phenomenal polling, you know, in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, if you will, and Gaza, the overwhelming majority of people living in the West Bank would vote for Hamas. And I think that's what happened before the war. People in the American administration just realized that if the elections were to be held as scheduled, then Hamas would win, and all of a sudden they got cold feet, and they, you know, said they pressured them to withdraw the elections, and Hamas was jealous, and they wanted to do something where they know would gain popular support, so they waged a war. Okay. Anyway, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
We received questions about the Palestinian Authority. We've been reading some reports that have been coming out for a long time about how the Palestinian Authority is becoming less stable and suffering from a deep crisis. I think Hadi Amr, our own Deputy Secretary for Israel-Palestine, actually said this. He said that he never seen the Palestinian Authority in worse shape. What do you think of this? How stable actually is the Palestinian Authority, and is it in a danger of falling in front of Hamas?
Oh, it's deeply unstable, and it's been that way for a long time. I mean, I've been for years trying to draw attention to the fact that Mahmoud Abbas is now, I think it's 16 years into a 4-year term. He's in poor health. He's falling asleep at meetings. He's losing his energy. The guy still actually used to smoke. Now he vapes. I guess that's more healthy. And you've got a succession crisis on your hands. Number one. Number two, as a result of the Gaza war, I think it became clear that Hamas had retaken the initiative. Again, that was the goal, I think, in launching the war after they were sidelined from the political process. Justifiably, they were sidelined, but they were angry and they wanted to reassert themselves. And I think they did a good job. I mean, one Israeli official that I talked to in June when I went there to do the interviews for the book, this is a senior official from the Ministry of Defense, said that it looked like they were defending Jerusalem. And B, it looked like they were, defending Islam and representing the Palestinian cause. And I think that's true. And so there was a lot of concern afterwards that we heard from the Biden administration, I think justifiably. And even I would say the Bennett government, Benny Gantz went and met with Mahmoud Abbas. We've actually seen a number of officials come through Ramallah. You won't see Bennett doing it. Bennett says he won't. But lesser ministers are going through and meeting with him in an attempt to kind of bolster the Palestinian Authority. Look, I think if we're thinking about things as a zero-sum game, as a binary, then yeah, you got to support the PA. But we've got a bigger problem here, is that neither one of these are particularly viable in terms of peace partners or even neighbors for Israel. The PA is still doing the pay for slay stuff, and the PA is deeply corrupt and diverting huge amounts of US taxpayer dollars. And they're not interested in peace. They're interested in self-preservation, and they're doing even a poor job at that. And then on the Hamas side, there's nobody to talk to because they don't recognize Israel, and it's a terrorist government. So what we have is two entities that we really can't work with. And it'd be one thing to say, look, let's get a new a succession plan in place. Let's start to swap out some of these, corrupt and sclerotic leaders, and let's put in some new people that can actually revitalize the Palestinian Authority and bring the Palestinians what they ultimately really deserve. But we're not seeing that. It's just an attempt to prop up Abbas. It kind of looks like, if you remember the movie Weekend at Bernie's, where we're carrying around a dead guy. I mean, Abbas is, he's, for all intents and purposes, he's politically dead. No one likes him. Nobody supports him. And yet he's the guy that we're putting all our chips on right now. It's a very bizarre spectacle coming out of the administration. And I think Hadi Amr is making a mistake in doing so.
Do you have any ideas of possible successors for, I think the name Mohammed Deif or Dief, I don't know how to pronounce it, has been floated around. Do you know?
Yeah, that's actually Mohammed Deif was a Hamas guy But there are other people that we have seen that that are possibilities. Mahmoud al-Alul is the vice chair of the Fatah party. Mohammed Shtaya is the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. These are people that are possibilities, but you have to remember, Sarah, what happened last time around when Yasser Arafat died in 2005. There was no vote, right? What happened was the PLO got together in the Muqata compound, and it was like when the Vatican gets together after a pope dies, right? They held a conclave among PLO executives to determine who would become the next leader. It was not done by the Palestinian people themselves. I don't think that if they did that again, I don't think the Palestinian people would take kindly to it, right? After everything that they've seen now with the Arab Spring and some of the other sort of Arab populations that are at least nominally gaining more control over their political futures, the idea that the PLO could once again determine who the leader would be on behalf of the people, I think is a real problem. And again, I think that it's something that we're going to need U.S. intervention. The problem is that as much as the U.S. seems to be really keen on propping up the PA, they don't seem terribly keen to engage in discussions about reform, right? They want to talk about Israeli settlements. They want to talk about things they don't like about Israel, but nobody dares talk about the things that are hurting the region coming out of the PA.
Thank you. We've received multiple questions about the recent news, about how the United States abstained in the UN from voting on the UNRWA or the Palestinian Right of Return affirmation resolution, which is, of course, it's a break from the record of the Trump administration. We're going back pretty much to the Obama days. So we've received multiple of requests asking you to comment on that.
In a word, shameful. I was joking on Twitter. I called it profiles in courage. It's the opposite of that, right? I mean, really just, it totally lacks courage. Look, there's a broader problem that we're seeing right now from the Biden administration, and that is that it's engaging with the most corrupt international organizations, the most corrupt UN organizations like UNRWA, and I would consider that to be probably top 2 or 3, but also the Human Rights Council, right? I mean, we had actually walked away from the Human Rights Council during the Trump years, and now we're walking right back into it and supporting it and legitimizing it. Same thing with UNRWA and supporting its mandate as we are. I think it's not only just false, it's untrue, but it's also giving the Palestinians a false sense of agency here. And that's the wrong message to be giving, that eventually we're going to need to tell the Palestinians that you want to negotiate on borders. Okay, those are things that I think are legitimate. You want to negotiate over Jerusalem, it's going to be a lot harder now, but there is no negotiation really over the descendants of refugees, right? 5 million people. How are you supposed to negotiate that? And it's not a realistic crisis. It is manufactured by UNRWA. And that, I think, really it needs to be addressed. I think the Biden administration does no one any favors by doing this. I'm not even sure that the Arab states even care about this as much as they used to, right? I mean, after the Abraham Accords, you've got the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan. I don't think they are agitating for this. I don't know who the administration thought they were going to placate with a move like this, but it was just downright bizarre to see.
That's exactly right. I do have to put in just one little plug for what we do at Emit, because every single day, Hussein and I are on the phone or on Zooms or in person with legislative staffers on Capitol Hill. And one of the things that we have been working really hard on is the UNRWA Accountability and Transparency Act, which calls for reform of the textbooks and vetting of the teachers who many of them are members of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And we have to, in fact, if people are listening, write your member of Congress and please ask them to support the UNRWA Accountability and Transparency Act. It's incredibly important. Anyhow, please go ahead, Hussein.
Thank you, Sarah. Jonathan, in this last summer, a lot of people sent us questions about the shocks of the reaction of the United States media, United States or activism in the country in general, whether attacks on Jews or the hostility to Israel. But at the same time, there was not a lot of news about mass demonstrations or Arab capitals against Israel. Is there a divergence between the United States or the discourse around Israel in the United States and what's going on right now in the Middle East? So can you speak also about the media coverage or the reactions in Arab countries towards Israel after the Abraham Accords?
Sure. So I actually have a piece coming out very soon in Al Arabiya that it's an excerpt from the book. There's a whole chapter where we look at this, and there was really a gap between what we saw out of the Arab world as opposed to what we saw here, which I think was, most of our media was just vitriolic in its excoriation of Israel. In the Arab world, early on, we saw all four of the Abraham Accords countries come out and condemn Israel. It was not as harsh at all as perhaps what we had seen in years past. I think it was a very positive sign. There were still moments of tension. When Arab audiences viewed some of the scenes of destruction in Gaza, it, I think, pulled at their heartstrings. I think there's no doubt about that. But I would also argue that there is a growing realization among the Arab populations as well as the leadership that the Palestinian issue cannot be a core national interest any longer. I think that's what we saw with the Abraham Accords themselves when they were entered into last year, and I think we saw it just with some of the general discourse in the Arab media. It just was less of a focus. It was not like this stuff was not running 24/7. Other news was appearing on channels like Al Arabiya, less so on Al Jazeera for reasons that I think we've already explained. But certainly it was not the kind of 24-hour on repeat outrage. We just didn't see it as much. There was still plenty there, but just not as much as it used to be. And I would actually also argue that at the end of the war, we saw some really interesting things. There was an Emirati that wrote a piece sort of putting all of this in perspective and pointing a finger at Iran, Bahrainis as well. Moroccans and the Sudanese made it clear that they rejected Iran and that they were sticking with the Abraham Accords. So overall, I have to say this was a stress test for these new peace agreements, and they passed. I don't want to say that everything's perfect. There's still concerns. There was one moment during the war I can recall where the Arabic Twitter handle for the Prime Minister's office used a Quranic statement to justify Israel's war against Hamas. And it really angered a number of my Arab friends from the Gulf, and they had mentioned it to me. But it was interesting. I mean, I reached out to some of the Israelis that I knew and said, guys, you got to get in touch with Ophir Gendelman. And eventually Ophir took it down. He said, okay, we don't need to do this. That was a bad tweet. Everyone has one. And so there's, I think, just a sensitivity on both sides now that they have a peace that they want to sustain. And so they're taking measures to do exactly that, and you can see it reflected in the media. So I was very pleased to see how that all played out during the war. Less pleased, I'll just say, with the coverage here in the United States. I would say that the coverage was rather vapid here. We didn't see a lot of coverage because everybody's too interested in yelling at each other about January 6th or about vaccinations or masks or whatever it is that people are outraged about every day. But when we did see the news, it was often poorly covered with analysts that were often really not prepared to talk about what was actually happening on the ground. And I, of course, found that very frustrating. And that's one of the main reasons why I wrote the book.
I just want to confirm what you're saying just from my daily conversations with Hussein, who grew up in Cairo and did not come here until 2000 and when was it, Hussein? 2012. And he wrote a piece and commentary called A Post-Palestine Middle East, and talking about how they have evolved in many of the Sunni Gulf states beyond the obsession with the Palestinian cause. However, Hussein, if you just for a minute want to talk about the disconnect between how you're seeing people in your Twitter feed in the Arab world and what you're hearing where you're going for your master's degree, and the difference between the Americans and many of the young Muslims and Arabs from these Gulf states. I think it would be really interesting just to confirm what it is that Jonathan has been saying.
Yeah, just very quickly, what Jonathan is saying is absolutely true. The Middle East, since the Arab Spring really was a watershed moment, in which we're seeing a lot of cultural, social, political developments, and the development of actually, I would say, Arab individualities. I mean, you have different societies with different priorities that are looking into different directions, and the pan-Arab kind of unity of the ranks around the Palestinian cause is truly no longer exists for a lot of people who are trying to, whether their priority is now economic development, better governance, stability, security, or democracy and human rights. You have all of those different Arab groups who are really prioritizing these important interests. However, you don't see that this discourse, and as Jonathan said, this is in the media and Arab intellectuals, but here it's not catching on. It's like two billiard balls with just two different separate spheres that don't communicate. The Arab Middle Eastern Scholars Barometer, which is a survey that was conducted, I think Mark Lynch and another Middle East scholars not too long ago, showed that over 60% of Middle Eastern scholars in the United States still think the Palestinian cause is kind of the most important issue in the Middle East at the moment, which is for a lot of Arabs is no longer true. But yes, absolutely, what Jonathan said is unfortunately and sadly very true. I think we have time for one more question. So there's a very important question that we received about Qatar. Qatar seems to be helping the Gazan people with basic human needs, cooperating with Israel and doing so, and they look very benign. What possible interest would an oil gas-rich Qatar have in fomenting Islamic extremism in the region?
Okay, well, that we could probably do a whole other lecture on this. But look, I think what we can say here is the Qataris, it's a very strange country. There are about 250,000 Qataris total, like in terms of their population. It's a country of about 1 million people. 800,000 of them are foreign workers from places like Bangladesh or from Pakistan or India. And the Qataris have more money than they know what to do with. People don't have to work, right? They are incredibly wealthy, and they are intent, for reasons that I never quite understood. They're intent upon maintaining a competition with their neighbors, specifically with the UAE and with the Saudis. And so it started with Al Jazeera. They created this television channel, and they basically used it as a bludgeon against their two Arab neighbors. And it was just vitriol coming out on a regular basis. And it's also worth noting that these two countries, Saudi and the UAE, are very much against the Muslim Brotherhood. They don't like the Brotherhood's admixture of politics and religion, right? These are countries, Saudi and the UAE, they like to have a monopoly on the religious and political thought of their countries, and they like a firewall between them. The Muslim Brotherhood does not abide by any of that. And so what you saw was the Qataris promoting Al Jazeera, which targeting their Arab neighbors, promoting the Muslim Brotherhood. Then it really got messy during the Arab Spring, where we saw the Qataris promoting Islamist governments in places like Tunisia and Hussein, obviously in your home country. In Egypt, a huge amount of effort, money was spent there, and it's been a battleground. And so there has been this ongoing process the Qataris have been engaged in. Hamas has always been one of their pet projects, in keeping with their Muslim Brotherhood Islamist activism. What's just so shocking to me, and I was actually just recently down at CENTCOM, where Israel has actually just joined the command, and the Qataris are part of the command too. And I was talking to some of their leadership there, and I said, guys, you're going to have a really interesting dynamic there now that Israel's joined, because the Qataris are working at cross purposes with the entire region. And now they're also going to be working at cross purposes with Israel, which is going to be probably your most important ally in the command. And I don't know the extent to which people fully understand how much of a mess Qatar has been making around the region. Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Hamas, you name it. Wherever there's trouble, you're going to find the Qataris. They need to be held to account. Problem is, because of their bottomless wealth, they have bought off lobbyists all across this town. They have bought off think tanks. They have bought off universities. Their influence is really, I mean, it's almost endless. And I appreciate any efforts that Emmett takes or any other to counter some of this influence, because it is truly malevolent, and it's unbelievable that it's gone largely undocumented even to this day.
Right. It is actually a matter of U.S. law that if you give $250,000 or above to a university, you're supposed to register. The Qataris just shower millions and millions and millions to American universities. And, unfortunately, it is like drug companies funding research. It's, and it makes people lose their objectivity. So before we adjourn, I want to again thank Jonathan Schanzer for this phenomenal book. She's held upside down here. This phenomenal book. It is extremely accessible as a foreign policy book like Jonathan could possibly write. But the research is, first class. And please support our friends at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy. They do phenomenal work, and we're always proud to ally with them. And if you can, please support Amit. I must say, also work incredibly hard. Not only, doing research and writing and having wonderful webinars, but also we work very hard on taking it to the next step on Capitol Hill every day. So if you can, please go to our website at amitonline.org and support Amit. And please also support our friends at www.fdd.org. They also do phenomenal work, and it's always an honor and a privilege to be able to partner with them. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And please, everyone, as soon as you can, when you log off, get off and get this wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you.